Hi everyone, welcome to Bio 139. I'm Scott Davis. I'm going to be your instructor this semester. Some of you probably had me for Bio 137, and if you did, this is going to seem very, very familiar. Really, this is just most of the second half of our textbook. I run it pretty much the exact same way that I ran Bio 137. If you did not have me for Bio 137, then I try to make this class as easy on you as possible. It is a very tough class. It is much more challenging even than Bio 137 was, but my goal is to give you all of the tools, all of the resources that you need to do well, but it is up to you to use those resources. And in the other video that was posted in Blackboard prior to this, the welcome and orientation video, I go through a little bit of what you need to do well in this class. And I also post the welcome announcements that kind of give a little bit of what you need to do well in this class. But keep in mind, while I do provide you everything that you need, it is up to you to take advantage of those things and to ask questions when you need to. Now, most of you are taking this in an online format. Some of you may be taking it in person and just watching these videos as supplementals. But regardless of how you are taking this class, I really, really encourage you to ask questions. If you're in my class, you know I provide my cell phone number for you to text anytime. You can also reach me by email anytime. I want you to ask those questions. If it's a question that you think is silly or that you will feel bad for asking it, don't. If you have a question, it needs asked. So please make sure to take advantage of all the materials that I give you, watch all of the lecture videos, fill out the outline, ask those questions, do the bonus work, do the practice work, all of that. The more you do, the better off you will be when it comes exam time. So let's go ahead and get started. So a little bit about today's agenda. Since this is the first video of actual classwork, a few things that I want to remind you about is make sure that you have looked over the syllabus and understand it. It has a syllabus acknowledgement form that goes with it. Make sure you answer all of those questions that you understand what it is that you're answering. I do have a video where I briefly go through the syllabus, but I don't read the entire thing for you. You can do that on your own, but there is a lot of very important information in there. And later in the semester, you are going to be tempted to reach out and ask a question, not about material, but just about the class itself. And chances are what you're going to ask is going to be found in the syllabus. So if you're going to ask a non-content related question, if you're going to ask a question just about how the class is run or rules or something like that, first check the syllabus, because chances are it will answer your question. Next, Blackboard. If you are in the fully online class, everything is delivered through Blackboard. If you are in the in-person class and you're watching this as a supplemental, we still have a lot of material in Blackboard. I do provide that welcome orientation video where I go through Blackboard. There's a lot of stuff there, so make sure that you look through everything just to get a good feel for it. If you can't find something, reach out and ask. And lastly, lab attire. If you are in a fully online class and you have lab online, this doesn't really apply to you. But if you are in a hybrid class or a fully online section, either of those will have on-campus lab. If you do have on-campus lab, make sure to pay attention to proper lab attire. Now, on cold days, it's not really going to be a problem. Everyone's going to be coming in proper lab attire just automatically. But if it's a warmer day, you cannot wear shorts or skirts to lab. No skin below the waist can be showing in lab. That means long pants or leggings or a long dress or something like that, you also have to wear closed-toed shoes. Now, scrubs or a lab coat are not required. They are sometimes recommended, especially in Bio 139. On some days, we are going to go see our human cadaver lab that I run, and you will definitely want to wear something like scrubs or a lab coat there. More about that when we get closer to it. So before we begin, what questions do you have? And I know this is an online class for most of you. It can be tough to ask questions, but the first thing that I want you to get used to, if you haven't had me before, and that is texting me those questions. I don't care what day it is, what time it is, if it's a holiday, if it's a weekend, if it's a break from class like spring break or fall break, it doesn't matter. Ask those questions. If you text, I'll get back to you right away within minutes, sometimes within seconds. The only time that I won't get right back to you is if it's overnight. I will get back to you in the morning when I wake up. Still ask the question overnight. It's not going to bother me. It's not going to wake me up. It's best to ask the question when you have it. So text me a question when you have it. If you're not comfortable texting me, you can email. It will take me a little longer to get back to you because it doesn't notify me right away. But still, ask those questions and don't be afraid to text. Most of my Bio 137 students get used to texting me pretty regularly, and by the time they get here to Bio 139, they don't even think about it. If you haven't had me before, partner up with someone who has, and they will tell you, yeah, I get right back to you. Ask the questions when you have them. So with that out of the way, it is time to dive into our first chapter, and we are beginning this semester with endocrine. In the past, we began with blood, but I think endocrine is going to fit a little bit better if we put it first, because it's going to introduce us to topics that we are going to study all semester long. Now, we could argue blood or endocrine, which one should come at the start, because really blood is the central theme of Bio 139. Everything we talk about this semester is going to relate to blood. Now, endocrine, the hormones that we're going to talk about, they're transported in the blood, so they tie into that also. But there's an argument for putting endocrine first because we are going to talk all semester long about hormones. And here we're going to introduce the hormones and the glands that release them. So sometimes we put blood first, sometimes we put endocrine first. We're going to go with endocrine first this semester just to introduce everyone to things that we will talk about. Now, just like Bio 137 with me, this is a constantly building class. Everything that we learn in chapter 16 is going to be foundational for everything that comes later. Now, when we learn this stuff and we get to the end and we take our exam, don't flush it from your head because we are going to use it throughout the semester. All right, so for those of you that haven't had me, you'll see that I like to put some funny stuff in the slides here and there just to make a difficult class a little more lighthearted. And one thing that I will say, if you have this downloaded, if you click there where it says Busey, it will take you to a video of Gary Busey, who, if you don't know him, he's a wild guy. And it will have this quote here when he actually said it. So that's a little something fun to watch if you want to start out with a little bit of a laugh. Now, one thing that I do for my in-person classes is I will have attendance questions that I give at the start of each class. That's how I know who is attending. Now, I don't take attendance in the traditional way in online classes, but I still want to give you all the same experience that my in-person classes get. That is something that I strive to do. Is an online class can feel very disconnected because I'm not there, you're not there, we're not in a classroom, but I want to give you the exact same experience or as close to it as possible to my in-person classes. So we will start each lecture with not really attendance questions, and these are the same kind of questions that I would ask in person. And I ask that when I read these, afterward you pause the video, try to answer the questions. Don't just wait for me to give the answer. That is something that students will do just so they can know what the answer is, and when they come to the first exam or quiz, they're not prepared. They haven't challenged themselves, they haven't worked through things, and they may think that they know the answer really, really easily, but in reality they're just really good at listening to the answer or looking the answer up. So try to answer these questions based on what you know, and don't just wait for me to give the answer. First, what are the two major communication networks in the body? And second, what are the big differences in the two? So go ahead and pause the video, try to answer those. Now hopefully you've done that, and I will say most of the time when we do not really attendance questions, they are going to be over something that we have recently covered or that ties into that day's lesson. Now here we haven't recently covered anything because this is the first lecture of the semester. These questions actually were covered in Bio 137 near the end. So what are the two major communication networks in the body? Well, the first is the nervous system, and the second is the endocrine system. Nervous system we covered extensively in Bio 137. It had very, very quick communication. It was sent very quickly. The response happened pretty much immediately. When you think about raising your arm, curling your bicep, whatever, it happens almost instantaneously. But when we communicate using the nervous system, even though it happens really, really quick, the response is very short-lived. Now, when we talk about the endocrine system, it has a little bit of a delay. Hormones are released and you don't get a response for a bit, sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, sometimes days. But the response is prolonged. The response acts a lot longer. So nervous system, quick acting but short lasting, and endocrine system, slow acting but long lasting. And the other thing is neurons communicate, or the nervous system communicates, using electrical activities along the nerve and chemical messengers, neurotransmitters, from neuron to neuron, or neuron to muscle, or neuron to gland. Now, endocrine, we use hormones. And there's lots of different types of hormones, and that's what this chapter and all the next few lectures are going to be about. So with that said, let's dive into a little bit of housekeeping. I will not have housekeeping at the beginning of every lecture, but sometimes there will be some important things that I want to point out. In lab, your first lab is going to be about the endocrine system and the reproductive system. Reproductive system, most of the time, we do not cover in lecture. We might mention it briefly, but we do not go into the chapter most of the time. But this chapter in lecture and your first lab, they go hand in hand. They are essentially one class. Even though they're taught in two different places or at two different times, it is one class. We're going to learn the glands and the hormones and all about them in lecture, and we have a lab chart that you're going to want to fill out, and it's very useful to fill it out while you watch these lectures. Now this first lecture, not so much, because we're just going to introduce the endocrine system. We're not going to get into the glands or the hormones until next lecture, but you do want to have that chart handy as we go through. So first, here is just a general diagram of the endocrine system. And over on the left is a list of the glands that we will be talking about, and on the right are their location in the body. So up here, there's a lot going on in the brain. There's something called the pineal gland, which we will only very briefly mention at the end. the hypothalamus and pituitary glands. This is something we will talk about extensively. We have 2 full lectures where we cover these. Thyroid and parathyroid in the neck, the thymus gland briefly mentioned at the end, right around the heart. It kind of sits on the surface of the heart and extends up towards the neck. The adrenal glands sit on the surface of each kidney. The pancreas sits right below the stomach, below and behind. And then the gonads, either the ovaries or the testes, in the lower pelvic region. So the next few lectures after today, we will spend going over 1 or 2 of these. Now, this is the last page of your chapter 16 outline, and we're not going to use it today, but I do want to point you to where we will find it. And this is just a guide to how the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the other glands kind of relate to each other. And this should look a little bit familiar, like something we might have seen back in Bio 137. We will get a little bit more detail on this towards the end of chapter 16, but just to give you an idea, this is kind of the basis for some homeostatic feedback loops. And that is something that you really want to brush up on throughout this entire semester, and especially in this chapter. We are going to talk about homeostatic feedback loops, mostly negative feedback, some positive feedback. So make sure, if that does not just automatically pop into your head and you know it exactly, make sure to go back to chapter 1 and review homeostatic feedback loops. And some definitions. So some definitions that we are going to use throughout this chapter, and you do need to know what these words mean, because you will see them throughout the chapter and you will see them on exams, and you do need to know what they mean when you see them. First, stimulus. In this chapter, stimulus is going to be what causes a gland to release a hormone. A stimulus, what causes a gland to release a hormone. So the general definition of stimulus is a stimulus is something that causes a response. But we're being more specific this chapter. The stimulus is what causes a gland to release a hormone. Next, function. Here we're going to be talking about what does the hormone cause? What does it do? Next, mechanism of action. And this is explaining how that function happens. What is it that the hormone actually causes at the cellular or tissue level that results in the function happening? We'll get into a lot of detail with that later, so that might clear up a little bit later, but just know function is what's happening big picture. Mechanism of action is what's happening at the molecular level. And lastly, inhibition. How do we stop a hormone either from being released or from having an action? So stimulus, what's causing the hormone to be released? Function, what does that hormone do? Mechanism of action, how does the hormone do it? Inhibition, how do we stop that hormone from being released or having some sort of action? These are not on your outline. It's a good idea to go ahead and write those in, but you do need to know what these 4 things mean, because we will be saying it a lot in this chapter and later in the semester. So now we're going to start with the outline. And if you haven't had me before, I do provide an outline for every chapter that we cover. I also provide on Blackboard our PowerPoints that I use here in lecture. I do not provide the full PowerPoint. There are going to be some things missing. So you will have to actually watch the lectures if you want to fill out those outlines. The outlines are not for a grade. They are just your study guide. I do not give an exam study guide because your outline is your study guide. So the more you fill that out, the better. And it's a good idea not to write long sentences or paragraphs. You just want to make brief notes so that it kind of reminds you of what we're talking about there. So let's begin. In this chapter, we're talking about the endocrine system. But what is endocrine? What does endocrine mean? As opposed to something else, exocrine. What does endocrine versus exocrine mean? Well, endocrine is a type of gland that does not have a duct. It does not have a duct. Instead, it empties its contents, its secretion, or in this case, its hormone, directly into the bloodstream. And that's what we see over here on the right. This kind of little blobby looking thing, that's an endocrine gland, and it is secreting its hormone into the bloodstream. This is an endocrine gland. Over on the left, this is an exocrine gland. An exocrine gland has a duct. That's what we see right here. Some sort of tube that we are releasing our product into. An exocrine gland empties its product into a duct, and then that duct releases the contents either onto the body's surface or into a hollow body organ. For example, sweat glands are exocrine. They have a sweat duct, and when we sweat, that sweat travels through the duct and onto our body surface. Also, along the digestive tract, we will see that there are glands that release their enzymes into a duct, which travels into a hollow body cavity, like the inside of the stomach, the inside of the intestines, something like that. But in this chapter, we are concerned with endocrine glands, no duct, and they secrete into the bloodstream. Now, kind of related to endocrine, there are some other types of hormones called autocrine and paracrine. In the case of an autocrine, here the cell releases something that then comes right back and stimulates the same cell that released it. And paracrine, very, very similar. A cell releases something that then stimulates neighboring cells. So autocrine stimulates itself, paracrine stimulates its neighbors. So now let's talk about different types of hormones. We will see throughout this chapter that there are many, many hormones in the body, but they fall into two broad classes. Three, kind of, which we'll see in just a little bit, but really we talk about two broad classes, and those are amino acid-based hormones. These could be individual amino acids, small chains of amino acids called peptides or polypeptides, or full proteins, but regardless, they are amino acid based. And the other type is steroid-based. So here, what we're looking at is amino acid-based hormones. Think back to Bio 137, when we were talking about the plasma membrane. What can and can't cross the plasma membrane? Well, things that are either big or things that are charged have a really tough time crossing the plasma membrane, so generally they don't. But amino acid-based hormones they can't cross the plasma membrane because they are relatively big and typically have charges. So the way that we work with our protein hormones, or well, with hormones in general, let's go back here. A gland secretes its hormone into the bloodstream, and then the bloodstream carries it to another part of the body where it's going to have an effect. So there may be a hormone that's released by part of the brain that then travels to something like your kidney where it's going to have an effect. The hormone travels in the blood, in this case the amino acid based hormone. It gets to the cell, but it can't get in. It can't cross the plasma membrane. So how does it communicate with the cell? How does it talk to the cell? How does it cause an action in the cell? Well, if a cell is responsive to a certain amino acid based hormone, it's going to have a protein receptor on the surface. That's what we see here. The little pink balls, those are an amino acid based hormone. This purple guy here, this is a receptor, which is a protein of some sort. And remember, proteins have a very, very specific shape. And for a protein to respond to something, it has to be shaped so that it can interact with something. So here, this amino acid based hormone is going to have a very specific shape, and the receptor is going to have a shape that fits with that hormone. If this were a different cell that was not responsive to that protein or that amino acid based hormone, it would not have any receptors for it. So only the cells that are receptive to a hormone that is amino acid based will have receptors for it. Now, when that hormone binds to a receptor, there's a few different things that can happen. Here we see something called the second messenger system. There are a few other alternatives, but they all behave the same basic way. I will say right now, looking at this, it's probably a little bit intimidating. The good news is, you do not need to know this. If you go on to higher level biology classes, you probably will. But for right now, you just need to know the big picture. A hormone, amino acid based, attaches to this protein receptor, and anytime you add something to or take something away from a protein, what does it do? Think back to Bio 137. It changes shape. So when this hormone, amino acid based hormone, binds to this receptor, protein, it's going to cause the receptor to change shape, which causes it to interact with another protein inside, which moves and interacts with another protein, which interacts with something that causes an effect to happen. So lots of different things can happen inside the cell, but they all happen because a hormone bound to a receptor. A different hormone would bind to a different receptor, and the other receptor would cause a chain of events that resulted in a different response inside the cell. And only the cells that have receptors to this amino acid based hormone will respond to that amino acid based hormone. The other type is steroid based. Steroid based hormones are based on cholesterol. Remember back in Bio 137 when we were looking at lipids in the body, we talked about cholesterol, and I said cholesterol gets a bad rap. If you have too much cholesterol in your body, it's bad. It causes things like vascular disease and high blood pressure. But we need cholesterol. We said, for one, our cell membrane had a lot of cholesterol in it. And here, too, steroid hormones are based on cholesterol. They're cholesterol with some things added to it. Now, the way steroid-based hormones work, well, since they are lipids, they have no charge. And since they have no charge, they can pass right through the cell membrane. And when they pass through the cell membrane, they attach to an internal receptor protein that carries it into the interior of the cell through a nuclear pore, and it attaches to DNA and stimulates production of a gene, or it stimulates a gene to be active. And remember what genes do? They start making a certain protein. So steroid hormones go right through the cell membrane, they go all the way through the nucleus to the DNA, and they cause transcription. That means that we're going to make a protein. So let's compare and contrast the two. Over here we have this big rectangular guy, which is a generic cell. If it is a peptide or amino acid-based hormone, it has to bind to a receptor on the surface of the cell, which goes through that domino effect and ultimately having some sort of effect inside the cell. If it's a steroid hormone, it goes straight through the membrane, straight through the nucleus, binds and starts transcribing DNA into protein, and we get some sort of effect. So why would we care if something is either a peptide hormone, amino acid based, or a steroid hormone, cholesterol based? What's the advantage of one over the other? Well, if it's a amino acid based hormone, it can only work on specific cells, the cells that have a receptor for that specific hormone. This allows us to be very, very specific. So later in this chapter and throughout the semester, we're going to be talking about a hormone called ADH, which is released by something in the brain, and it works on something in the kidneys. It also works on something in the blood vessels. It does not do anything at all to bone cells. Why is that? Because bone cells do not have a receptor for ADH, but cells in the kidneys and cells in the blood vessels do. Steroid hormones, on the other hand, they can work on pretty much every cell in the body because they can pass right through the cell membrane and go right to the DNA. So steroid hormones tend to have effects that are very, very general. They work on a bigger scale. They do something just like increase metabolism or increase production of heat or something like that. But I said there was actually kind of a third class, and that's something called a biogenic amine. And your book doesn't really mention these too much, but I do want to talk about them just because you'll probably see them at some point in your program. And biogenic amines, they kind of have a little bit of both. They kind of behave a little bit like a protein. They kind of behave a little bit like a steroid. And the two that we will be talking about most in this chapter is thyroid hormone, surprisingly released by the thyroid. Well, it behaves more like a steroid. It's not a steroid, but it behaves like a steroid. And epinephrine, released from the adrenal glands, it behaves more like an amino acid-based hormone. It is not an amino acid-based hormone, but it behaves like it. So those are the biogenic amines that we will be talking about. They're not really amino acid based. They're not really cholesterol based. They kind of behave a little bit like both. So now let's talk about the different types of stimuli. We will be more specific when we get to each hormone, but the types of stimuli fall into three categories. And the first is a humoral stimulus or a humoral stimulus. Here, our body is constantly monitoring levels of something in our blood. Maybe it's levels of calcium in our blood, like we see here. Maybe it's levels of glucose in our blood. So whatever it is, we are monitoring levels of something in our blood. And when that level gets too high or when that level gets too low, it stimulates a gland to release a hormone. Now, we briefly talked about this back in Bio 137 using almost this exact same picture. When blood calcium gets too low, the parathyroid glands release parathyroid hormone. We mentioned that in Bio 137. Well, that is a humoral stimulus. Changes in calcium levels in the blood stimulate hormonal release. Right now, this is just to demonstrate what humoral stimulus is. We will talk more about parathyroid later on. Next, neural stimulus. We also talked about this in Bio 137. Here, a neuron, a nerve, is going to send a signal to a gland. It's going to send an action potential, and then that is going to stimulate a gland to release its hormone. In this case, we're seeing when this neuron sends a signal to the adrenal gland medulla, it releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. We talked about that at the very end of Bio 137. That is a neural stimulus. And lastly, one that we're going to talk about extensively at the end of this chapter is hormonal stimulus. Sometimes a hormone triggers the release of another hormone. Sometimes you will hear this called tropic hormones. Tropic hormones. So tropins or tropic hormones are hormones that stimulate a different gland to release a different hormone. Lots of examples of this, so we will see those over the next several lectures. But hormones are released by a gland, they're carried in the blood, but that could potentially cause problems. So if a gland releases something that is hydrophilic, remember hydrophilic, it's polar, well, it can just dissolve in the blood. That's fine, no big deal. A cell releases the hormone, or gland releases the hormone, it travels into the bloodstream and it carries away until it gets to its destination. But some other hormones, well, maybe they're hydrophobic, maybe they're non-polar. Well, that's kind of like oil. If you put oil in water, what happens? It doesn't mix, and that's not good when we're talking putting something in blood. So if we release a hydrophobic hormone into the bloodstream, we have to make sure that it's not going to separate. So what we do is we bind it to a special carrier protein like we see here. And the carrier protein helps it to dissolve in the blood. It carries it away to its destination, and then it releases it at its destination. Now, this part is not in your outline, it's not in your book, but it's interesting, and that is how some hormones interact with other hormones. And when two or more hormones interact with each other, they kind of fall into three categories. The first is synergistic effects. So synergistic hormones are two hormones that work together and they kind of magnify each other. One example of that is follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and testosterone. FSH by itself has an effect. Testosterone by itself has an effect. But when FSH and testosterone are released together, FSH's effect is magnified. Testosterone's effect is magnified. They are synergistic to each other. They magnify each other's effects. Another one is a permissive effect. In permissive effect, one hormone allows another hormone to have an action. For example, estrogen and progesterone. Well, progesterone, if it is released by itself, it has very, very little, if any, effect. But if estrogen is released first, that will cause other cells to be much more receptive to progesterone. So estrogen is permissive for progesterone. And the third type is antagonistic effects. Now these are very common. Antagonistic effects, one hormone blocks the effects or inhibits the effects of another hormone. For example, when estrogen is being released, it blocks the release of prolactin. Estrogen blocks the release of prolactin. Insulin and glucagon work against each other to maintain blood sugar levels. When insulin is being released, it blocks glucagon. When glucagon is being released, it blocks insulin. Now, I do not expect you to know these. These are just to describe what a synergistic effect, a permissive effect, or an antagonistic effect is. And lastly, hormone clearance. Well, when hormones are released, they travel, they do their job, but at some point we need them to stop doing their job. We can't just have them continually causing some sort of effect. So hormone clearance is how do we stop hormones from having an effect? There's a lot of different ways that this happens. Once they get to their target tissue or target cells, well, they're just metabolized. The cell breaks them down, uses their parts for something else. The liver is something that cleanses our blood. It takes things out of the blood and breaks them down to either be placed into the bile and ultimately into the feces to be passed out of the body, or it breaks them down into other metabolites that the body can use elsewhere. The kidneys will just pull them out of the blood and we pass them in urine. So there's lots of ways that the body has hormone clearance activity to get rid of hormones once they're done. But the big picture here is hormones don't always have an effect because our body is always getting rid of them. All right, you have made it through the first lecture of Bio 139. Be sure to listen to it a time or two. Make sure that it makes sense. Make sure to fill out your outline, read, understand, and anything that you don't, reach out, text, email, whatever you have to do to get this to make sense. All right, starting in our next chapter, we will start being more our next lecture, we will start being more specific. We will talk about a gland or two and some of the hormones that are released, how they do their job, what their jobs are. All right, take care, and I will see you in the next lecture.